I apologize. I was telling them earlier, I apologize in advance if my 4-year-old, whose bedroom is on the other side of my office wall, busts in at any point to tell me to lower my voice. I also want to apologize for my voice. I have bronchitis. I feel fine. I just sound like a prepubescent teenage boy. So I have my green tea to help coat my throat as we get through what I like to call the Game of Thrones of the Bible, which is the book of Judges and the story of Saul. Do you remember that show game? I mean, I asked that to a bunch of college students, but y'all remember Game of Thrones and like the intrigue and the murder and the death and destruction and like all the horrible, awful scenes that sucked you in at first and then shame, the whole 9 yards. Well, that's the book of Judges. I mean, George R. R. Martin was just totally ripping off the sacred scripture and the story of the Israelites and their failure and their falling into sin. And so I know that y'all were talking about like leading up to this point, they're on their way to the promised land. They arrive at the promised land. And I have notes, by the way, because there's like so many things that go on in this story that I had to type out the whole story for myself. So if you see me glancing off to the side, I have a cheat sheet. But basically there's all of these awful stories in the book of Judges that illustrate one key point. And it's basically this: when we don't know who we belong to, and when we don't know our identity in God, then we very quickly become distracted by what's immediately around us. So in the case of the Israelites, it's the pagan lands that they're in and the pagan practices that seem attractive or that seem easy. Maybe it's easy. And so we arrive in this place where Joshua's renewed the covenant with God. They finally made it. And they're in this land. There's all these funny names that I can look up the pronunciations of them and then I forget them immediately afterwards. But they're in this one specific spot, Gilgal, and they've been there too long. They're not settling the land. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. So there's a lot of weeping and grinding of teeth and sadness. And they build this new camp, which literally translates to the word weeping. And it begs this continual question. It's like the Israelites know what they're doing is wrong. They know that they're consistently failing and falling into sin and destruction, that they're falling into these patterns that are leading them further and further away from God. Why do they keep doing it? I mean, and this is the larger question that I think all of us can ask. Like, if we have a perpetual sin that we consistently go back to, it's like, why do I keep doing this? I know it's bad for me. It brings me a lot of shame. I'm consistently confessing it. And Father and I both know that this is a problem, and yet I can't overcome it. And in the case of the Israelites, and I think sometimes the case for us too, we don't remember. I mean, there's a lot of remembrance that needs to be happening. The remembrance of God's promises and God's blessings, the remembrance of God offering healing in our lives. In the case of the Israelites, remembering whose they are. Joshua's generation, right? They fought the war. They landed, they earned the promised land. And even though they had their own failings and misgivings and mistakes, it was their story. And then they failed to teach that story to the next generation. I mean, it literally says this in the book of Judges. They didn't catechize their children. They didn't share with them, this is who we are, this is whose we are, this is what we did, this is why we worship God in this way. And so this next generation doesn't actually have any ownership of what's happened. They have no ownership of this land that they've found themselves in. They have no ownership of these practices. This covenant, even though it was renewed, doesn't seem to be theirs. And I mean, as you read the book of Judges, as you dig into the stories, as you look at the commentaries, one of two things usually happens to me when I read the book of Judges. And as we tell the story, I feel kind of sorry for the Israelites during all of this. Like, did they really ever have a chance to succeed because it wasn't really their story? Like, were they set up for failure because their parents didn't teach them what they needed to learn, what they needed to know? Was there any way that they could have, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and tried to somehow pursue actual relationship with the Lord and do what the Lord has invited them to do? I mean, I guess maybe that's a question we can ask God in heaven someday. But as we dig into like what ends up happening and the things these people do, these horrible things, I mean, like dismemberment of concubines at the end of the story, that again, like Game of Thrones doesn't hold a candle to some of this stuff. You think to yourself, oh, it can't get any worse. And then it gets a whole lot worse. And that's the pattern. We see this consistently. There's this sinning and this repetitive cycle that we get all throughout the book of Judges. They sin. sometimes in like a really big way, sometimes in even just small ways. Sometimes it's like casual idolatry, and sometimes it's dismemberment of concubines. And then they enter into servitude. I know that sounds like super casual, but like that's a huge part of the story at the end of the book. And then they enter into servitude. And so they beg God for freedom. They cry out in supplication. It's sin, servitude, supplication. God brings them a judge. He brings them somebody to really help deliver them into salvation. And, things are fine for a little while. The judge is doing sort of a good job. We get a few good judges. And then the judge themselves, the judges, by the way, are like king lights. Like they're not kings. They're rulers that are supposed to really help provide judgment for the people. Not a judge in the sense of like we have somebody that issues a ruling, but a judge in the sense of they're giving guidance to the people. But they forget what the judge has done and leading them into this salvation. And so they enter right back into the pattern of sin and entering into servitude and crying out for God's blessings. And then they're given God's blessings. And then they very, very quickly forget them. They're petulant, spoiled little children. But yet they're petulant, spoiled little children who don't know who they belong to. And so they really, just like a 4-year-old who's not actually given clear commands, won't necessarily do what they're supposed to do of their own accord. In some sense, you hear about these Israelites and you wonder, is this truly what happens when you don't know your identity in God? Is this what happens when you don't actually know that you have been given not only a command, but promises have been fulfilled in your life? You've been delivered into this land. Now do what God is asking of you. And so we get these stories, and we're about to get into a couple of them, this repetitive falling away from God, all back into this idea of idolatry and identity. If I don't have my identity in God, I'm going to search for my identity somewhere else. My identity is going to come from where I am. Where I am is a land of pagan idolatry. And so therefore, that's what I'm going to find my identity in. And then we start to get this idea of harlotry, where they're being seduced by the things of this world, and their vision is constantly being distracted by what's around them and what seems to be pleasing initially, what's pleasing to the eyes. We'll get to that with the story of Samson in just a few minutes. But the story, it doesn't begin all terrible. We have a couple of good judges, Othniel and Deborah. I mean, they're faithful. They're good. They lead the people in a good way. They defeat who they're supposed to defeat. People are prosperous for a time. And then eventually the Midianites return to some power. They oppress Israel again. There's a lot of like ins and outs. And if you read the book of Judges, like if you sit down and you try to get through it, I would highly recommend just taping like a chapter a night and trying to visualize all these different battles and these fights and some of these conversations where the people are being oppressed. And God calls forth a man named Gideon. We've heard the name Gideon before, right? He's like a good guy. Well, Gideon's actually, he's clever. He's a clever guy. See, the Midianites would steal from the Israelites. They would, in some sense, kind of tax them. And Gideon doesn't want to give up what he's worked for, what he's earned. So he beats his wheat inside this wine press that he's hidden indoors. So the Midianites don't know what he's doing and they won't end up stealing his wheat. It's pretty clever. And so this angel appears to him, similar to how, the burning bush appears to Moses, and he hears the voice of the Lord, and the Lord tells him, you're going to lead my people. And Gideon plays the false humility, like, oh no, like I can't do that. That's not for me. Like I'm just this humble guy who's beating my wheat, like leave me alone. But God repeatedly shows him again and again. And there's some really cool stories about this. There's a fleece that is left out and then it ends up dry. And God kind of shows him repeatedly, like, no, like I'm with you. I'm for you. I'm on your side. And so Gideon accepts the command. He's like, fine, okay, I'll do what you asked me to do. He raises up this army. They fight Midian. And he raises up this huge army to fight Midian. And God consistently tells him, make your army smaller. Make your army smaller. And it seems like, come on, God, like you want them to defeat these people. You want them to win their lands. Why does he need a small army? And it's because God's trying to show the people, like, yes, Gideon is your leader, but I am your God. And I am the one that's delivering you. And I want you to know that this victory is mine. So Gideon listens to him. And then they win. Yay. Everything should be good, right? Like, let's move on to the next story. And Gideon, realizing, the people like him and the people are very happy with their win, they try to raise Gideon up as a king. We're going to see this theme later on. The people of Israel are desperate for a leader that they think is just going to make their life easier. Oh, if we have a king, then nobody can attack us. If we have a king, then like everybody, they'll just tell us what to do. And see, God, the original plan wasn't necessarily for God to raise up this human king among them. He wanted the people to be able to, in some sense, govern themselves, to be guided and led by these wise, judgmental characters who could show them the righteous path, but that people would have autonomy over themselves and to understand that I am accepting what you have told me. And they just want it to be, no, Gideon will be our king. He'll tell us what to do. Gideon says no. He recognizes that's not what God wants for him. He refuses. This is a time of judges. It's not a time of kings, but he's a man. He's a greedy man. And he sees there's all these spoils of war. And so Gideon demands this large portion of the spoils of war. And he ends up spending the money on this gold bejeweled garment. And he starts to sleep around. He ends up taking quite a few wives and like raises himself up like a king, not really, thinking, okay, well, the people are going to be totally fine with this. And he gets seduced. I mean, it's constant seduction in the book of Judges, these stories of these men and these women raised up in power. And then the spoils of war and the riches of the world and these pagan practices, which are just so easy, much easier than the worship that God's demand. It constantly distracts them. They forget way too easily who their God is because they were never really taught in the first place. Because the Israelite story is a story, I'm convinced, of constant distraction by the stuff of this world, which, if that's not familiar to where we live in the 21st century, I'm not exactly sure what could be more familiar. Constant distraction by the things of this world that lead us away from an actual vision of what God wants for our lives. So Gideon, he has a bunch of wives. He ends up having 70 sons. One of his sons, the name of one of his sons literally translates to "my father is king." That's going to be the worst son in the story. He ends up he makes himself a ruler. He takes over power. He ends up killing all of his brothers. He ends up killing all of Gideon's sons except one. And this continued pattern of infighting among the Israelites starts to grow, this hatefulness, this warring. There ends up being one judge who decides after he wins a battle, he sacrifices his own daughter because there's this pagan practice of like when you win, you have to make this sacrifice to the gods. And so he makes this oath where he's like, oh yeah, well, I'm going to sacrifice one of my own daughters and that'll be pleasing to the pagan gods. And then I'll make, the proper sacrifice to the one true God. And there's this mixture of God's covenant and promises with these pagan practices because again, they don't truly know what it is that God is inviting them into. They don't truly know what it is that they believe. You'd think that so much of this could have been solved in the beginning by a bunch of parents just like sitting down and doing a decent CCD class, which again sounds incredibly familiar to where we are in the church right now. But there's these constant stories of men and women, of judges, of Israelites that they're on the cusp of doing the right thing. You think finally we've gotten to the part of the story where it's all going to be okay. And like, they'll stop screwing up and everything's going to be fine. And then you just get like another tragic tale. Again, I know I've said it a million times at this point, but it's Game of Thrones. It's when you're rooting for somebody and you're thinking, okay, you're going to be the one, like you're going to save the kingdom. And then they do something horrible and terrible. And you're let down even more, which is why sacred scripture is just so much fun to read sometimes. And so in the book of Judges, you remember this story from VBS and from your CCD classes and your Sunday schools, the story of Samson and Delilah, which as children, we were always told like Samson was a big, strong man and Delilah cut off his hair. And it was so sad. But it's like actually a horrible story about a man his eyes get gouged out. Like I'll just totally ruin it right now. So Samson and Delilah, again, that most popular story, there's this barren couple. They beg God for a child. They finally receive the gift of a son. They dedicate him to the Lord with this Nazirite vow. And the Nazirite vow was threefold. Okay. So you can't drink alcohol. So he would not have done well in college. You have to avoid contact with dead bodies. So that's pretty generally easy, depending on the college you go to, I guess. And you can't cut your hair, right? You have to refrain from cutting your hair. And so as a result of like following these commands, namely the hair thing was huge. He would be blessed with great strength. Well, the story of Samson, and we get this phrase repeatedly in Judges. We hear about Samson's eyes. We get a lot of hints throughout the book of Judges about the Israelites' wandering eyes. They look at all these things that the world has to offer them and they find them pleasing. And Samson, he's got a bit of a wandering eye. And so he demands that his father arrange a marriage with this Philistine woman. And so he's journeying to the wedding. By the way, he probably shouldn't have been marrying a Philistine woman. He's on the way to the wedding and he takes a bit of a shortcut and he goes through these vineyards. And remember, he's a Nazarite, so he's not supposed to drink. And technically, he's not even supposed to be around the fruit of the vine. So he's in the vineyard, and almost kind of in like this spiritual moment, this lion attacks him, like as if to say, like, Samson, you're not supposed to be here. And he fights off the lion with his bare hands, wins. Like, this is great. Like, Samson's incredibly strong. Goes back home, doesn't tell his parents what's happened, like, obviously, because he wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. Well, the next day, he goes back that same way. What an idiot. And he passes by the carcass of this dead lion that he strangled the day before. And the body of the lion is inexplicably filled with bees and honey. And, he's back in this forbidden place. Nobody's around. Samson's got this wandering eye. He decides, you know what? I'm going to eat some of that honey. It looks really good. So now, not only is he around, I know that sounds kind of gross, but like, I mean, this is the Israelites. So he's there, right? And he sees the dead lion filled with honey, eats the honey. So now he's had contact with a dead body. He's in this vineyard. He's not supposed to be there. It's showing us this pattern of weakness. As we get further and further into the book of Judges, we start to see the weakness of the Israelite people even more and more on display. And it's not weakness simply because they're weak-minded or they're feeble. It's weakness because they don't know who they are. When you don't know your identity, when you don't know whose you are, then so many things in this world can distract you and lead you astray. Well, Samson ends up at his wedding. There's this huge feast, the description of which in sacred scripture leads us to believe that Samson was drunk out of his mind. There's lots of partying at the wedding. So now he's drinking. He's touched this dead body. He's marrying this Philistine woman. He ends up basically making a bet with these 30 Philistine men at the wedding. And there's this huge brawl, this huge violent outbreak at his own wedding. His wife gets killed. And so as a result, he kills all these Philistine men. And everybody is like obviously mad at Samson because now there's been death and destruction. It's the red wedding on full display. And he gets distracted again by this other harlot. And he starts pursuing this harlot in the land of Gaza. So another Philistine woman. Philistines are mad. They want to defeat Samson. So what do? They find a harlot that could maybe distract him again. Enter Delilah. She seduces Samson. They start sleeping together. She's being paid off by the Philistines. She sleeps with him so many times that she finds out what she can do to weaken him, cut off his hair. She cuts off his hair. The Philistines attack. They gouge his eyes out. And so like now Samson's like a threat that's been eliminated. And like, this isn't even like the most horrible part of the book of Judges. Like, we're just getting started. So immediately after the story of Samson, we meet this guy named Micah from the tribe of Dan. And we find out that Micah is a thief. He robs his mother of this money. The mother curses the thief. She's infuriated that this money has been stolen from her. Micah feels bad. Oh, he stole from his mom. So he gives her the money back. The mother decides to consecrate the money to the Lord, and then in secret takes the money and goes and buys this graven, molten idolatry image. And so there's this continued perversion again and again in these big ways and these subtle ways of the Israelite people constantly turning the worship that they're supposed to have in their lives on its head. Micah, by the way, fun fact, Samson's son, I don't know if I said that all the way, by way of Delilah. So like we've got this continued perversion of the line. We've got this continued perversion of the tribes of Israel, this continued perversion of these people. We finally think we've arrived at, okay, we can't go any further. And yet the people are continuing this seduction by idolatry. These people are continuing to recognize that these things of the world might be more attractive to them. Now, before we go to kind of the last big story of the book of Judges, which just leads us to a place of real sadness. And you're like, okay, now I get it. I get why these people wanted a king, because they're just all fighting against each other. I want to reiterate just one more time, and this is the teacher in me. There's a reason for this behavior. I mean, in the same way that like you go to the same priest over and over again for confession, he starts to point out like, okay, well, this might be the root of your sin. Like maybe it's pride, or maybe it's lust, or maybe it's greed. What's the root of all of this for the Israelite people? And I know I sound like a broken record, but it's this lack of remembrance of the covenant. It's this lack of remembrance of where they came from, of how long they were enslaved, of how long they traveled to get to the promised land. At this point, they're so far removed from the legacy of Moses. They're so far removed from the story of their ancestors that they just don't seem to remember who they are and how they're called to live. I mean, and we get the perversion of this story over and over again, all of these tribes becoming more and more more and more corrupted, more and more befuddled, more and more confused. I mean, more and more thieves and robs, and I mean, thievery and robbery. And Moses' grandson gets involved, and he hires this Levite priest, and this Levite priest abandons the job that he was supposed to have. And just go read the book of Judges, and you'll be captivated by the craziness that happens. And but the worst story of all, and kind of the way the book of Judges ends. So there's this Levite priest who takes a concubine from Bethlehem. And that implies that this concubine is from the tribe of Judah, and Levites were only supposed to marry fellow Levites from the fellow tribe of Levi. That was one of the rules according to their tribe. Well, the concubine ends up betraying the Levite priest. She sleeps with someone else. And so the priest goes after her to reclaim his property. And as they're journeying home on their way back, some men of the tribe of Benjamin attack them. And they demand that the Levite priest give himself up to them, a la Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Levite says, no, I'm not going to do that. And he sends his concubine into the crowd of men. And she's assaulted and violently exploited all night long while he sleeps happily in his tent. He wakes up the next morning to find his concubine near death. And we don't know exactly when she dies at this point. And different scholars actually dispute this. Like, did the Levite priest kill her himself? Did she die on the way home? Either way, they get back to his home. He dismembers the woman. He cuts her into 12 pieces, and he sends the 12 pieces to all of the tribes to say, look what the tribe of Benjamin did, and incites war among the tribes of Israel against the tribe of Benjamin. The tribes unite. They kill all but 600 of the members of the tribe of Benjamin. And then eventually, in order to allow the tribe of Benjamin to repopulate, take the remaining virgins of this other tribe and give them over to the tribe of Benjamin. So this massive war has been sparked by a rape that then ends with the rape of hundreds and hundreds of these virgin women by the tribe of Benjamin, so they can recreate their tribe and hopefully no longer have these evil men who killed this concubine originally. If you think it's bad, it's even worse, because they've fallen so far from what God has asked of them, which is to enter into the promised land, propagate belief and faith in the one true God. And they're now warring against one another. And it then kind of begs the question among the Israelite people, what are we doing? Who is leading us? Clearly, the Judges thing is not working out. Like, we've ended the story with a guy chopping a concubine into 12 pieces and mailing it out to all of the tribes so that everybody can go to war. We want a king. And the book of Judges actually ends with they're kind of haunting words. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And every time I read that phrase, and I don't read it very often because spending time in the book of Judges is incredibly depressing, I feel like. But every time I hear that phrase, you know what I'm reminded of? I'm reminded of 21st century America, where all of us just do what's right in our own eyes because, well, I can make my own decisions. It's obvious. It's obvious that the people need a leader. They need a king. And so they beg. They want anyone to lead them and enter into the stories of, and we're only going to get to a couple of them because you've got lots more to come in this whole awesome series that y'all are doing, the stories of Samuel, Saul, David, and Solomon. Samuel's a prophet. He's the final judge over Israel, and of course is raised up as a prophet. He's dedicated to the Lord from his birth. Most of us know the story, of course, because he's called by God, and he's an old man eventually. That's really the part of the story where we're rushing to. His sons have succeeded him as judges over Israel, and they're horrible. Like, they're just horrible. They're corrupt, they're cruel, and so the people beg Samuel. They beg him for a king. And Samuel warns them. I mean, he tells them, like, you know what you're asking, right? Like, you raise up a king, you demand a king. Well, now you have a monarchy and you have a royal court. And that has to be sustained. This is that you are leading yourself to a place of possibly being exploited someday, which is eventually what's going to happen, not to spoil the story, but it does. They get a whole lot of bad kings too. I feel like human beings with power is just a bad idea, right? Like, isn't that seem to be kind of the major theme that we're getting in sacred scripture? Like, maybe God should have all the power. Well, God eventually does deliver them a king at the request, of course, of Samuel. we meet Saul. Now, Saul, we might know him as, of course, the first ruler. He's actually declared a king kind of in like a backdoor way because Saul wants to play the humble and only God is king. He ends up leading the Israelites in a victory over the Ammonites. And he, of course, he gives praise to God. He recalls God's goodness, but there's a major tragic flaw in Saul. And it's actually, I think, a tragic flaw that a lot of us can identify with. And it's that Saul is incredibly insecure. I mean, the story of Saul, if you think the story of Samson and Delilah is bad, or the story of the Levite priest and his raped and murdered concubine is bad, the story of Saul is just tragically sad. Because it's a story of a man that even in the face of success, winning these military battles, even in the face of power, he doesn't know how to obey God's commands. Because he deeply believes, and it really is a tragically sad story, that God's not actually on his side. It's almost as if Saul believes that God is constantly setting him up for failure. Like there's this one story where he's supposed to wait to go into battle until Samuel arrives, and Samuel's going to get there in 7 days. And he doesn't get there like immediately at the beginning of the 7th day. And so Saul takes matters into his own hands and he goes into battle and he violates the commands of the prophet and of God. And it's just kind of this subtle little, Saul doesn't trust that God's got his best interests at heart. He's got this fear and insecurity that God's somehow against him. And maybe that insecurity and fear is actually something that's in all of the Israelite people's hearts, because again, they don't know the covenant. They don't know who they are. They don't know the promises that God has given them because it was never really taught to them, which is namely the big command that God had given in the beginning. And then there's the story, and it's kind of a roundabout, wacky story, but Saul imposes this really harsh set of rules upon his army. And the army, they break the rules, and quite a few of the guys, they go and they eat this raw flesh because they're starving and they're famished and they're not supposed to do that. And so Saul lifts the oath because he realizes, okay, this is crazy. Like, I don't want these guys to eat raw flesh. If they're really that hungry, they can eat. But he finds out that his son has disobeyed the rule. And so rather than seem weak as if he like overturned the rule, he decides instead that he's just going to order for his son to be killed. I mean, that's how insecure he is. Like, he doesn't want anybody to look at him as this weak ruler. He doesn't want anybody to look at him as a guy that could ever go back on his original word. The last kind of little piece of Saul that it doesn't even really seem like that big of a deal. Like, he orders for his own son to be killed. Like, you'd think that that's like the worst thing that anybody could ever do. But it's this very little subtle hint that Saul, after a battle, he takes the spoils of war before he's supposed to. And he lies about it. And he says, oh, we took the spoils of war because we were going to make sacrifices to God. And Samuel calls him out and he says, behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice. And there is really the heart of the story of Judges and the story of Saul's really tragic failure as the first king. That when we don't obey God's commands because we don't know them or we don't trust them, it's incredibly easy for us to just fall into these patterns of doing what's convenient or easy or what's immediately pleasing. And it shows a hard heart. I mean, it shows us ultimately these two stories, the book of Judges, which is complicated and lots of crazy names and there's ins and outs of all these wacky things that happen and these horrible moments that like HBO can't even begin to compare to. And then we get this story of Saul and this guy that is just at every turn is just not good. Like, you think he's going to be good and you're rooting for him and then he's just not, and you just get disappointed. It harkens back to this idea that if we don't know God and if we don't know what God is asking of us, then we'll just let anything fill our heads and follow whatever seems immediately convenient or instantly pleasurable and lead us into this path of what's ultimately destructive for us and for others. And so we see these major themes. God speaks, we refuse to listen. God leads, and we get distracted by the sights and sounds of this world. God gives us commands, and we decide, oh, we're going to come up with our own rules of operation. And it begs, and here's your cliffhanger and your teaser. Is there anyone in the land of Israel who's actually after God's own heart? Is there anybody who actually longs to do the will of God? Who is humble enough to listen, who's humble enough to know what he doesn't know, who's willing to revive the story that the people had once been told, and to understand what it is that God is drawing us into, which is not only deeper communion with him, but to do what the Israelites were always supposed to do, right? To enter into the promised land, to take it over, to propagate the faith. I mean, the book of Judges, as tragic and sad as it is, and these stories of failure and these judges that really end up being probably far worse for Israel, rather than them just never having any judges, and these stories of death, destruction, and murder, and sex, and intrigue, and all of this stuff that ends up happening, that you read it and you think, how is God letting all of this happen? It's not actually that foreign of a story if you think about our own lives, and if you think about the ways that we constantly drift away from what God is asking of us. And so when you eventually meet David, and I think you get to meet him next week, you'll start to see that a huge part of the story of God actually acting in this world is showing us how we can fashion our hearts after his, how we can make ourselves in his image and likeness as we are originally made, rather than trying to fashion God in our image and likeness because it's more convenient, or we somehow convince ourselves that it's easy. So all of that to say, go read the book of Judges, but like maybe not alone, and maybe like not late at night, because there's some really creepy and wacky stuff in there. And, you know, you're not doing so horrible if you're not chopping up concubines into 12 pieces and mailing them out to people. Like, there's some comfort in that. Like, we're not all horrible like that. But I do think it begs the question of, what are the ways that I am not paying attention to what God is offering me and what God is asking of me, and am instead getting distracted by the stuff that is convenient and right around me. And so if nothing else, the book of Judges and the story of Saul is probably perfect college reading, because what a distracting time college can sometimes be. So all that to say, that's your lesson for the night on Judges and Saul and God's version of the Red Wedding. I don't know. I don't know if there's questions and answers. Like, I don't know all of it. I highly recommend reading the book Walking with God. I'm sure many of you have maybe grabbed a copy of it. It's from Jeff Cavins. This is what I had to use in grad school, mostly because he taught the class. So he made us buy his own book, but it was really great. And it was a great refresher course today when I was prepping.
Just a little about what you do now, and like where you came from, what you did before.
Yeah. So I was I went to the University of Dallas in Irving, Texas. I got a theology degree. I lived in Chicago for a year, hated it. It was too cold. I'm a Southerner at heart. My blood is very thin. It's 50 degrees outside right now, and the heat is on in my house, and I'm in a sweatshirt. So that should indicate to you why I cannot live in the North. That's why this is on Zoom, because the thought of flying to Ohio in November was not high on my, and I have kids, but like, so I moved back to Lake Charles, Louisiana. If you look at Louisiana, we're the heel of the boot. We're right by Texas. And I taught freshman theology, which is Old Testament theology, for 5 years. And in my 5th year, my husband and I were newlyweds, and Rose, who you saw earlier, she was born in August of 2017. And so I left the classroom and I started traveling full-time and speaking. Really up until 2019 and into 2020, pre-COVID, I was on the road 10 to 20 days a month. I jet set across the world. I was in England 4 times in 2019. I went to Australia. I wrote a few books during that time. And I was just incredibly busy, very much a workaholic. I was also a youth minister while I was teaching too. That little side note. And then COVID shut everything down, obviously, in March of 2020. And as horrible as COVID was, it was actually an incredible blessing in disguise, because it allowed me to be home really for the first time ever since having Rose. Like, I took my 4 months of maternity leave, and then I was on the road full time. And in the year of 2020, I started working very closely with Ave Maria Press. They're a Catholic publisher based out of Notre Dame, Indiana. And we started developing this podcast called Ave Explores, and this whole series of digging into Catholic topics. So everyday Catholics and how they live extraordinary faith. We developed Ave Explores and Ave Spotlight, 2 incredibly successful podcasts for Ave that I'm very, very proud of. And in August of 2020, as the rest of the world was losing their jobs, I got a little phone call from the Catholic channel in the Archdiocese of New York. And they asked me, would I be interested in hosting a day of a radio show? I said, sure. And then they called back a few months later and they said, do you want to do a week? I said, sure. And then in March of 2021, nearly 365 days to the day that I left the road, I started doing a daily radio show for Sirius XM. So I go live from right here every day on satellite radio from 1 to 3 Central, channel 129. You can subscribe for free for the first 4 months and then get everything on demand on the Sirius XM app if you want. And it's a Catholic talk show. I'm the only female host on the channel. That's kind of cool. A little bit of job security there. And I get to talk about all sorts of things, whether it's mom life or what does it look like to try to live Catholicism day by day. Today we talked about Thanksgiving and not rushing into Advent too quickly, but like actually appreciating a season of gratitude. And I talked about decorating my house with turkeys. Like I'm super into scarecrows and turkeys right now because I'm not rushing into Advent. And it's great fun. You can call in. We have callers every day. We have guests that come onto the show. I'm probably going to hit up Father and Kevin to come on the show soon because we're always looking for people to join us. And it's a lot of fun. I mean, I get paid to talk, so I can't complain. So, Father, do y'all know about Father John Burns? He wrote a really awesome book for Advent called Adore. It's a journal with artist work from Valerie Delgado, who's Pax Valerie on Instagram. So I got to help develop this with Ave. And so we have 4 podcast episodes coming out about this. And so Heather, Sister Miriam, Sarah Swafford, and Father John are joining us for that. So I actually interviewed Father John. So Sister Miriam was supposed to be like my 5 o'clock interview, and we rearranged things because she was busy and I had this. And I was like, I've got to read about the book of Judges. Like I remember some of it, but like I need to actually be able to talk about Samson somewhat intelligently. Because that's a crazy story. Samson's story is like, why do we tell children the story of Samson and Delilah? That should not be something we tell little children. Like I don't want my child coming home and telling me Samson's hair got cut off and his eyes were gouged out. Like that's 6th grade minimum. Like we are not talking about that in pre-K. No. My kids go to Catholic school, so who knows what's going to come out of her mouth. The other day, I was informed that they read Peter and the Wolf. Remember Peter and the Wolf? Like you listened to Peter and the Wolf as kids, and when the wolf ate the duck, my 4-year-old announced very loudly in class, "Oh man, he's really going to have to poop." So we had to have a whole conversation about what is appropriate to say in the middle of the story and what is not appropriate to say. So that's my kid. So speaking of, I need to go tuck her in. She is banging on the wall on the other side of this computer right now. And so normally she and I lay down and we listen to an audiobook together. So I've got to go tuck her in. It was great to visit with you guys. Y'all can follow me on Instagram, Katie P. McGrady, and I'll show you pictures of my kids there. But thank you guys for having me. It was great fun.
So much. We appreciate you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.